I knew I shouldn't have done it, but I did. And I'll be honest, I don't regret it for a single second. Even now, if I could take it all back, I would make the same mistake. Because sometimes a mistake is actually the best choice you can make in life. I'm Sarah, I'm 32 years old, I live in Brooklyn, and from the outside my life looks organized, even perfect. Every morning I drink my coffee in my shiny kitchen and look out the window and say to myself, everything is fine. Because it's supposed to be. I have a nice house. I have a good job. I have a husband. It's one of those perfect lives that everyone envies. But nobody looks at the inside, right? Because no one can see how empty you feel inside when you lay your head on the pillow at night. Richard and I have been married for 7 years. Maybe we were in love, at least I thought so, but time erodes everything, even love. The man I loved at first became someone else. Or rather, nothing happened. I don't know if he stopped loving me, but one thing is certain. He didn't notice me anymore. He wasn't a bad person, never. He didn't cheat on me, he didn't yell at me, he didn't hurt me. But you see, sometimes the greatest evil is not to exist. Instead of loving me, he forgot me. He would go to work in the morning, come back tired in the evening, sit in front of the TV and just sit there. He would eat, go to his room and sleep. It had been maybe 2 years since we forgot to touch each other. Yes, 2 years. If I told anyone about it, they'd say, how do you stand it? But I did. Because I got used to it. That was the worst thing. But then Jake moved out. Next door, on the ground floor. You know me, I'm not very friendly with my neighbors, but Jake caught my attention right away. To be honest, the feeling was different. The first time I saw him, he was unloading boxes from his truck. He was wearing an old oil-stained t-shirt, his arms were muscular, his hands were covered in motor oil, but he didn't care. He's one of those cool guys, the laid-back kind. The kind of guy who's confident in his own skin. And I think that was the most dangerous one. First there were small coincidences. Running into each other in front of the apartment, falling next to each other at the grocery store, watching him fixing cars from the window where I drank my morning coffee. I can't say I did it on purpose, but the truth is, I think my subconscious had already chosen him. Then one day, I dropped my key by the mailboxes, he bent down, picked it up and handed it to me. And that was it. But in that moment everything changed. I can't describe the electric surge that went through me when our hands touched. My heart sped up. My breathing became heavy. Jake looked into my eyes, I looked into his. And in that moment, we both thought the same thing. That this was wrong. But just because it was wrong didn't mean we were going to stop. After that moment, things changed. I noticed the way Jake looked at me. Our conversations got longer. The casual good morning took on meaning. Coincidences were no longer coincidences. Because he and I both knew exactly where this was going. A husband who showed in every way that he didn't want me. And a man who brought me back to life with one look. Which one would you choose? I did. And I'm on a path of no return. I knew it was wrong. But sometimes you feel more right in wrong. And that's exactly what Jake made me feel. That I was alive. That moment in front of those mailboxes was like a spark. It was fleeting, but it was enough to start a fire. From that day on, Jake's presence in my life felt less like a shadow and more like a weight filling a huge void. At first it was small things. In the mornings when I opened the front door, I started waiting for him to come out first. On the way to the grocery store, I started making excuses for him to help me by making my bag a little heavier. He knew it too. He was playing this game too. But only up to a point. It was one afternoon. Richard was at work, as usual. It was so hot that I opened the window and tried to catch my breath, and then I saw Jake. He was standing in front of the apartment building, by the garage door, smoking a cigarette. He had a beer in his hand, his sleeves rolled up. As usual, nonchalant but charming. And I don't know how it happened, but I couldn't help what was going through my mind as I stood there in front of that window watching him. That's when he looked up. We locked eyes. I think it lasted 3 or 4 seconds. But during those 4 seconds, it was like he read me. It was like he saw everything that was going on in my brain. The hunger, the absence, the longing. And it was as if he knew that he was the man to fulfill it all. He didn't look away. Neither did I. Then he took a drag from his cigarette and nodded down. That was the biggest decision I've ever made in my life. I went. I didn't knock. because it was open. He was waiting for me. We stood in the living room. We both knew what we were going to do, but for a few seconds we just stared at each other. There was fear and excitement in me. Finally Jake spoke. "This is so wrong," he said, smiling. But he didn't sound remorseful at all. "Yes," I said, smiling back. But I didn't back down. And then the distance between us closed. I don't even remember how it happened, but I know one thing. I needed him. Just like he needed me. That night everything changed. We talked for hours. We laughed. He told me about his old life, how many cars he wrecked in his youth, how he moved here, why he was here. I told him about Richard, or rather how Richard had let me forget. And then, without thinking, I did something irreversible. I'll never forget that night. Because that night, I wasn't the same Sarah anymore. I approached Jake. I looked into his eyes. My heart was pounding, but there was no fear. There was only want. That part of me that I'd suppressed for so long, that I'd forgotten even existed, I couldn't hold back anymore. Jake was standing right in front of me. His breath was warm. When he put his hands on my waist, I felt my whole body shiver. He bent his head slightly, his lips right next to my neck. He wasn't touching, but his breath touched my skin. Even in those few seconds I couldn't stop the feelings that went through me. For the first time I felt that someone really wanted me. And then, the last boundary between us was lifted. He pushed me against the wall, and I gasped as his hands slid down my back. When his lips touched my neck, an involuntary moan escaped me. In that moment, I couldn't think of anything. My husband, my marriage, right and wrong. I didn't care. There was only Jake in that moment. His fingers tangled in my hair, he leaned my head back slightly. I was so open to him, like I'd been waiting for this moment for years. When he touched my lips, there was no turning back. It was a kiss so hungry, so wild, that it fueled the fire that had started to burn inside me. My hands went to his back. I felt him stiffen as my fingernails dug lightly into his skin. He picked me up and sat me on the kitchen counter. As our hands and bodies entwined, I felt that we were now completely lost. That night, we forgot what we were, who we were. We just touched, felt, consumed. Hours later, lying next to each other, panting, I took a drag from Jake's cigarette, watching the ceiling. In that moment, a strange peace came over me. For the first time I wasn't thinking about the morning of a night, I was just living that night. But this peace didn't last long. Because there was a knock at the door. It was Richard. My whole body froze. Jake jumped up and I froze on the bed, wrapped in the blankets, my heart beating like it was going to rip out of my chest. The knock came again. Harder. "Sarah, are you home?" There was a strange anger in his voice. Maybe there was doubt in it. The only thing I could think of at that moment was how to escape. But there was no escape. Jake turned to me quietly. "Are you going to say something?" he whispered. There was no fear in his eyes, but he was waiting for something. For me to make a decision. I walked to the door, my hands shaking. As I grabbed the doorknob, a great battle raged inside me. To tell the truth? To lie? And then I opened the door. I smiled. "I was making you breakfast," I said. Richard walked in, not suspecting a thing. Behind me, in the darkness of the room, stood Jake. And in that moment, I knew I was going to live in this secret for the rest of my life. I was someone else now in a lie, but at least in a life I felt. And that was enough for me.